Kennedy assassination.
Didn't start with
Oswald,
Can we just, so is it starting
yeah,
here? Streaming?
not so much about Oswald, but about Oswald as a figure that is discussed by Priscilla. So the book is more, his book is about the Warren Commission, but it focuses on quite a few of the same topics that Priscilla held. Fortunately, though, we have two excellent experts who discuss that as well. So let me briefly introduce each of them, then and please continue eating as the seminar proceeds. There's a lot of food here. We don't want it to be left over because the refrigerator is all that big. So first, we'll be starting over on the right here is Thomas Powers. Tom Powers, who is very prominent journalist and writer who has long been one of the outstanding figures on national security affairs and intelligence, and has written brilliantly about Marina, and we did a review of it and other commentaries about it. So we'll be discussing that. Then next to him is James Hirschberg, James G. Hirschberg, who is a professor of history at George Washington University. He was also the founding director of the Cold War International History Project based at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and got to know Priscilla through the former PhD supervisor of Jim, who died only very recently.
Undergraduate thesis.
Undergraduate thesis supervisor, Martin Sherwin of the Fletcher School here, and Priscilla and Marty were longtime friends, and both wrote books about J. Robert Oppenheimer, and Jim will be discussing that book in Priscilla's, among others, and we'll also discuss Marty because he actually died even more recently than Priscilla did. He died in December, October. And then next to him is a colleague and friend of mine, Frederick Logevall, originally from Sweden, but has long lived in the United States. He's a professor of history in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences here, and also at the Kennedy School, the place over near the Charles River. And he is an expert on U.S. foreign policy and on national security affairs, wrote award-winning books on the Vietnam War, among other subjects. It's also written more broadly about U.S. foreign policy, and also was a figure that Priscilla deeply admired. She has read his book on Vietnam, among others. And then Nick Daniloff, who is sitting right here eating lunch, who is a longtime colleague of mine. He has been at originally the Russian Research Center and now the Data Center for, I guess, about 35 years or so. And he had been a journalist and had gotten to know Priscilla in the Soviet Union. They overlapped there in the 60s, I think it was. And Nick reported for many years from the Soviet Union for numerous publications, but particularly for U.S. News and World Report for many years. And it was during that time that he had the distinctly unpleasant experience of being arrested in August 1986, of being arrested and accused of being a spy and held in the Fort prison for, I think it was for 2 weeks. Yeah, for 2 weeks. And so he, but he also has known Priscilla from happier times. So we read it. And so he and has been, was a friend of Priscilla's until the time of her death. I will also comment on Priscilla's expertise on the Soviet Union. That's really where she began, having come out of the experience in dealing in doing the degree here, the MA degree here, and then going to the Soviet Union without quite knowing what she would pursue there or find there. But she did some freelance writing there, freelance journalism, and then got involved with the book that came out in the mid-60s on Soviet cultural affairs, focuses mostly on the early 60s. So it deals with a period when there was a debate in the Soviet Union about the extent of the thaw, including the publication of a book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But then she subsequently also worked on what became the book of memoirs or reflections, at least, by Svetlana Allerieva, one of the daughters of Stalin. And that book, which came out in English, Priscilla translated it. She had the experience at that point of living for a while with Svetlana Allerieva, and not very easy. Is it phone written?
That's my phone, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I thought it was from the seal. I thought maybe it was one of those Watergate phones. She had the uneasy relationship with Svetlana Allerieva, which I guess is true of just about anyone who is a relative of Stalin. But Priscilla nonetheless turned out the book, The 100 Letters to a Friend. And that book proved to be, still widely used, even though I have some problems with it myself. But the book is still a very useful one in trying to shed light at least on I'm not so sure about what it says about Stalin. But Adam Ulam, among others, though, did use it quite extensively in the biography he wrote of Stalin. So it's not to say that it can't be used in these circumstances. Okay, so with that, I think maybe I'll go in the order in which I mentioned people. So please, first time.
It's nice to see so many people here to think about Priscilla and talk about the things that interested her so much, many of which are at white heat at the moment. I have three things here to do. I think here's one of them is to read a few works that I couldn't be here. And the other is to read a brief reminiscence from Bill Lanowette, who's, I think, the idea first was to hold a symposium of this sort in Priscilla's honor. He couldn't be here either. His wife recently broke her leg. Sounds like somebody who lives in a place with snow and ice, but it was San Diego. Max couldn't come because he was just thinking too much about his mother. And he had, apparently it's a special day, a year after the death of a mother in the Jewish calendar, when the thoughts all come to a head. And he just didn't feel he could go out into the world this time. So at the last minute, he wrote and said he just couldn't come, and he asked me if I would read a couple of things that he had hoped to talk about if he'd come here. She once told me, he's talking about Priscilla, that shortly after starting the book that would become Marina and Lee, she sought out Tilly Olson, who was in Cambridge. Olson was in the first class of Radcliffe Fellows. Priscilla wanted, perhaps needed, perspective on the underside of American life and why someone in that milieu would turn to communism. Olson's advice to Priscilla was to give Oswald back his humanity. I think she told me this as I was opening the refrigerator door one morning while we were eating breakfast. That would be very likely. Everyone knows Priscilla. She would love that kitchen. She would love to talk to people in the kitchen. Priscilla did achieve that in her twin biography, and in the process returned Oswald's agency in the assassination. And of course, as you, Tom, pointed out in your time review, she also left no room for him to have conspired with others. Another recollection I have is from the time when we were talking about how long books can take. And she began telling me the story of her collaboration with Svetlana Stalin, which began soon after Stalin defected in 1967 and caused a long delay in Marina and Lee. He called Svetlana and Marina my two Russians, and was hard pressed to say which one was more trouble. Both products of Soviet society, but the extremes. One a privileged Soviet princess, the other having endured typically hard-scrabble Soviet upbringing. And Bill Lanowet also asked me to read something. He very sorry that he couldn't be here. Would like to have seen everybody and to discuss all the things that will be on the table today. But he added a couple of things that he remembered himself. Trouble began on April 18th in 1994 when the Neil Lehrer NewsHour ran a story about special tasks, the memoirs of an unwanted witness, a Soviet spy master, a book said to be by Soviet spy Pavel Sudoplatov, that was actually written by his son Anatoly and the journalists Gerald and Leona Schechter. Time magazine published an exclusive excerpt on April 25th, alleging that Niels Bohr, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, and Leo Szilard had all collaborated with the Soviets to share atomic secrets during World War II. Priscilla was then at work on the ruin of J. Robert Oppenheimer and knew that Sudoplatov claims were false. She broke off to write a letter to the New York Times and helped me prepare for a rebuttal on the NewsHour on April 26th. That night, David Holloway was also interviewed, and together we cited several factual errors in the book and challenged the Schechters about their sources. Jeremy Stone, the Federation of American Scientists, enlisted Priscilla and me to write articles for a special edition of the Fast newsletter that corrected Sudoplatov's false claims about Oppenheimer and Szilard. Priscilla also phoned colleagues to offer us documents and insights as letters and op-eds and reviews appeared in due time by Marty Sherwin, Tom Bowers, Stanley Goldberg, and Richard Rhodes. With the title Flimsy Memories, Priscilla reviewed the book for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, noting what can happen when old men try to remember, prodded by editorial collaborators who publish a story without corroborating evidence. When we first challenged the Schechters on the NewsHour, Gerald's only defense was to say that more factual material we believe will be forthcoming. We're all still waiting. I remember that period very well. Someone and I talked about it a lot. The book was shocking in its errors and omissions and imaginings beyond the normal, sure. And when you actually get right down to it, it was billed as the translation of Sudoplatov's memoirs. But there was, in fact, no Russian original. The book appeared in English, and then when requests were made for the Russian original, there was long delays, and eventually they returned a Russian translation of the English book, exactly word for word. They were working from nothing. And I can remember how angry we all were at the idea that you would accuse people like Bohr and Oppenheimer and Szilard and Enrico Fermi of, betraying secrets in the middle of wartime to the Russians with no evidence and with no real reason to think it was true, and actually forced to write the book yourself so you would be able to fulfill a contract. And we were really bad. And people don't talk very much about that book anymore, which is okay. I'm very sorry that Max isn't, because he had a deep understanding of the long argument that has followed Kennedy's death, and especially the long argument that has followed the publication of the report of the Warren Commission. Initially, the idea that there was a lone actor, Lee Harvey Oswald, was it, seemed reasonable and well substantiated by volumes of evidence that the commission had collected. I think there were 11 volumes of evidence, something like that. It was a lot. But shortly thereafter, people began to attack all the basic claims in the accepted version of what had actually happened, including very basic claims about Oswald's role and what gun was used to kill Kennedy and who bought that gun and why, and a lot of other things that Priscilla had addressed in her book, Melina and Lee. That was the beginning of a long period of denial on the part of a political faction that's difficult exactly to define. And limb in and identify clearly. But it came in the wake of Vietnam, and people were mad at the government. And one of the ways they expressed that anger was to deny the truth of the Warren Commission and to, in fact, insist that the government had collaborated in suppressing the truth at the very least, and maybe in the assassination itself. And they haven't given up this program of denial ever since. The thing that Max knows and can really talk about is what the conversation among the conspiracists is like about Priscilla, because she stands just dead center in the way of their being able to construct an alternative theory, an alternative group of facts, and an alternative story. And so they have attacked her from every conceivable angle, and personally, intellectually, in terms of her honesty, whether or not she actually knew the people she says she did, and from every corner. And it goes to extremes of wording and accompanied by threats, and in every way, it's just a dark and ugly piece of intellectual history in the United States. Max can describe that. And Priscilla needs defending. Personally, she needs defending. And that book of hers, Worryingly, needs defending, because in fact, it's really reliable, that everything in it pretty much has stood up. And she herself deserves to be defended. What we know about Oswald and Marina and all the people they knew in Dallas, to a large degree, comes from Priscilla. And it's not just because she gathered all the facts and knew where everybody lived and what their phone numbers were. It's because she knew them. She spent tons of time with all of them. She has personal judgments about all those people and how they lived together. And anybody who's read Marina and Lee, I imagine, I guess, will have reached a similar conclusion to mine by when they get to the end, that this life is very closely examined, very closely followed, especially in the final weeks and months as the fatal moment was approaching. And you try and find a minute in there, a free minute in Oswald's day to talk to the mafia or to be on the phone with Fidel Castro about arranging the assassination of the president. It's not there. There's nothing there that suggests that that was going on all the time in the background. The foreground is so rich and full and so dense that it stands up. So I'm pleased that everybody's here in her honor and in a mood, I hope, to defend her.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Tom. Let me turn, I think, Jim, let me turn next to Fred.
Sure.
One thing I hadn't mentioned about Fred is that he is writing a biography of John F. Kennedy. The first volume already came out, which covers pretty much up to the time of the presidency. But the second volume, which Fred, I'm not quite clear on whether it will be out next year or maybe you can enlighten us on that. But in any event, the second volume, though, among other topics, will cover the Kennedy assassination. So let me turn next.
It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you, to follow Tom and to say a few words. So I do not know her as well as all, or certainly most of you do her. But I had two absolutely marvelous interviews with Priscilla. I saw her maybe on 3 or 4 other occasions. And I want to just say a couple things about the interviews, what she taught me about John F. Kennedy and her understanding of him, her relationship with him. We also talked quite a bit about Jackie, who she knew separately from JFK. That was really helpful to me. We made plans to see each other in last year, and then I was so looking forward to that, and I did get the opportunity to see her again. I just want to say that she was remarkable in so many ways. She was congenial, she was incisive, she was generous, she was fair-minded in her judgments. She was empathetic, is the best word I can think of, both with respect to her assessment of JFK, which helped inform my own sense of him, and also in how she talked about others that we discussed. And she said to me right off the bat, I think in our first interview, which was in 2017, I was just beginning to form my opinions about Kennedy. I had written about JFK in previous works, notably pertaining to the Vietnam War, to the Cold War, but this was a biography. This was something I hadn't done before. And so to talk with somebody who had worked for him beginning in 1953 was just marvelous. But she said to me in that first interview, I did not think, Fred, that John F. Kennedy in 1960 was ready for the presidency. She said I would have supported Adlai Stevenson had the two of them been competing against each other for the nomination. She said to me, I would have been with Stevenson. So that was interesting. And I asked her why. And she said something like this. I was trying to capture this exactly, but she said something like John F. Kennedy was harboring two lies. What were those? She said it was his marriage and it was his health. She said, I had a sense of his health problems that few other people did, certainly on the staff. And I also had a sense of the state of his marriage. And then she went on to talk about that in a very I think, instructive way for me. But it turned out, as we talked further both that day and in our subsequent interview, that her view of John F. Kennedy was complex. She said the issue for her was not his lack of seriousness or his lack of capability. She said he had both in spades. She talked about his marvelous sense of humor, which was self-deprecating and which she thought was key to his political success. She marveled at his self-possession, his intense curiosity. This she thought was one of his most appealing characteristics. And he had I think the way she put it to me was that he had a deep interest in excellence in human endeavor. So whether it's a carpenter or a baseball pitcher, he was fascinated by what made people really good at what they did. And that was something she also really liked about him. I mention all of this because, as I said, I was beginning to form my own opinions. Many of the things that she said about him, we didn't, I think, agree on everything. But on issue after issue, I think what she told me about in those interviews, I think have then been confirmed by my own subsequent research. She said, just a couple more examples. He was a relentless questioner of his staff and of others. He was suspicious of dogma, she said more than once, of certitudes, both whether from the right or the left. And I see Andrew Schlesinger is with us, and I was in the Schlesinger papers at the New York Public Library yesterday in the journals that you know so well. And this comes out in Arthur Schlesinger's own writings in 1959 and 1960 as the nomination battle is heating up. This sense that for him too, John F. Kennedy is suspicious of the extremes, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I wanted to say a word about her initial research for Kennedy, which was on Indochina. So she came on staff in 1953. About the same time as Ted Sorensen came on board. Sorensen, of course, looms very large in my own study. So it's interesting that the two of them arrived at about the same time. And Kennedy wanted her to do research on Indochina. And Priscilla said, well, I don't really know that. Senator. He said, that's okay. You can still do this work. And what's fascinating about this, ladies and gentlemen, is that if you go down the streets to the Kennedy Library in Dorchester, you can find the fruits of Priscilla's work on behalf of the senator that spring of 1953. So I've written in a book called Embers of War, which is really a history in some ways of the French War and of the early US involvement. This period in 53 is a key period because the French war effort is failing. Kennedy, because of his own skepticism about French prospects in the war, he had visited Indochina with his brother Bobby and with Patricia, their sister, in the fall of 51. So he is already pretty knowledgeable about this, but he wants Priscilla to pursue more research about how things look for the French. And as I said, so interesting to go into the Kennedy Library, which I, of course, have done and will continue to do for volume 2, but to see that what she produced for him. And so she and I talked about that experience, how he responded to what she produced in China. In the second interview that we had, and it turned out to be the last interview, we talked about the Cold War. We moved forward in time, and she offered me her views on 1963, a kind of counterfactual assessment of efforts that Kennedy and Khrushchev took in that last year following the missile crisis to reduce Cold War tensions. And she said, I got this from my notes in preparation for today. She said that if the assassination hadn't happened, Kennedy might have built on the settlement of the Cold War, and after winning re-election, gone on to wind down the Cold War. This is at least what Priscilla suggested to me. She attaches real importance to 1963. And I do intend in the second volume of this biography, which I'm working on now, as Mark pointed out, to explore what 1963 meant for the Cold War. I think it's a very interesting period. I just want to say a couple of words about the scholarship, and here I'm following what Tom said. In particular, I want to say something about Marina and Lee. I love this line, which is from the foreword to the 2013 edition of that book. It's Joseph Finder who writes in that foreword. I recommend to you have the original version. I think it's 14, this foreword that he wrote for the 2013 edition. McMillan's book undermines all the conspiracy theories so successfully because it doesn't set out to do so. Marina and Lee, that is to say, doesn't polemicize, it portrays. It's alive to the small crevices of character, and to the vast and irreducible role of chance. And it's perfect in my view. Tom, who's just spoken to us, I also recommend to you his New York Times review of the original edition. He writes, other books about the Kennedy assassination are all smoke and no fire. Marina and Lee burns. If you can find the heart to read it, you may finally begin to forget the phantom gunman on the grassy knoll. He says, and this would be interesting to have Max Holland respond or amplify, but Tom writes that the book achieves with art what the Warren Commission failed to do with its report, offering a persuasive case that Oswald acted alone as the assassin. But it's an altogether marvelous book. I don't need to say much more about it because Tom has already spoken about it, but it's rich in detail. It's passionate, but in a controlled way, and it's compelling. So I think I'm going to stop there. Room for more discussion, but thank you for this opportunity.
Excellent, thanks a lot for that. Yeah, if Max were here, he would also talk about the many virtues of that book. His own book on the Warren Commission, I think, will be along similar lines, but it will also just amplify the important points that both Tom and Karen raised. So with that, let me, I think, turn next to Jim. And I'm also going to give Jim leeway to speak about Marty Sherwin, who was an important friend of Priscilla's, but also had died because he also died quite recently. So please, Jim.
Thanks, Mark, and it's a great.
Oh, let me, before you go, please. I was just sitting there. Please eat it. There are quite a few people in the room. That
Jim won't be offended when you get up to,
I won't be
I hear a number of
offended.
people haven't eaten yet.
People,
So
people
please do
like me, Mark, cannot chew and listen at the same time.
Okay, well, I don't think it's that.
I don't have that
Please go
ability,
ahead.
I promise, I'll visit the place.
I just don't want all that.
Okay, thanks, Mark, and thanks to all of you. It's a great honor to be part of this event. Although, as Tom said, and Mark has said, there are other nuclear historians in particular, who knew Priscilla better, who were senior to me, and the great. I know the initial idea was to have multiple panels, including one specifically on nuclear issues. I only got to know Priscilla in her incarnation as a nuclear historian And I have to say, I've learned a ton getting ready for this, and already from hearing Tom and Fred talk about Priscilla. You know, one thing that in our conversation, I don't remember ever hearing from her is what got her obsessed specifically by Oppenheimer. Personally, I can see what obsesses her in terms of the meaning of his story for the nuclear danger that she was so galvanized by, and which she saw the Oppenheimer case as being a national calamity for having deepened. But, you know, I suspect, you know, there might be some interesting specific story that I hope she wrote down somewhere, and maybe I could track down at some point. It was exactly 40 years ago this spring that I did my Harvard College undergraduate thesis on James Bryant Conant and the atomic bomb. And Conant, of course, was Oppenheimer's boss on the Manhattan Project. And I was lucky enough, as Mark and I alluded to, that even though he was not a professor at Harvard, Martin J. Sherwin was a visiting fellow at the Charles Warren Center at Harvard. And completely by luck, as I was fishing for a topic for my senior undergraduate history thesis, I discovered Martin J. Sherwin's book, A World Destroyed, the Atomic Bomb and the Grand Alliance. And he ended up being my advisor. That began a lifelong fascination with nuclear issues. I was already fascinated by nuclear issues, but a much more intense one. It led to eventually a 1,000-page book on Conant, teaching nuclear history, where I still assign Martin J. Sherwin's book. You know, came out in 1975 before the Russian archives opened and a lot of other sources. And I still think it's the best. But also it was Marty who introduced me to Priscilla, because at that point, the group of historians who trying to treat the nuclear arms race as history was a really tiny coterie. Most people who studied nuclear issues as late as the early 1980s studied it from the perspective of engineering, military strategy, political science, with people like Thomas Schelling. It just so happened Martin J. Sherwin had been 5-6 years earlier the first historian as a assistant professor at Princeton to teach the story of the atomic bomb and the origins of the nuclear arms as a history class. And he had gone on to do that at Tufts. And at that point, he was able to introduce me to Dan Kevlis, who had just written about the history of American physicists. He introduced me to Greg Herkin, who also, it's a shame, is not here because he is also one of the great Oppenheimerologists and knew Priscilla very well. And literally it was a handful, at most a couple of extra fingers, but I was lucky enough that Marty introduced me to Priscilla. And from the moment I met her, I found her conversation about Oppenheimer to be fascinating. And looking back on that initial connection and my earliest conversations with her, that also struck me about her book, and which also actually indirectly relates back to Marina and Lee and her book, her work with Stalin's daughter, who had defected to the United States, which is she's incredibly sensitive about individuals and personality, and she constructs the key characters, both the villains of the story and some she identifies as hero, and Oppenheimer himself, who has elements of both. It's not a hagiography about Oppenheimer. She deeply admires Oppenheimer, recognizes his eloquence, how brilliant he was, but also that he had a streak of cruelty, as Priscilla mentioned at one point, his arrogance. It's interesting, the historian of science David Hollinger, in a comment on Priscilla's book, The Rune of J. Robert Oppenheimer, said, it challenges the question that Oppenheimer's story is best viewed as a tragedy, implying that, it doesn't exactly fit that story. And, I was also struck, again, reading it over, that there was more complexity to a character like William Borden, who wrote the letter to J. Edgar Hoover in the fall of 1953 that led directly to this stripping of Oppenheimer's security clearance and then to the hearing. And Borden was an aide to the key Senator Brian McMahon, who chaired the Joint Committee on Atomic, but who drafted letters for him demanding that Truman build the hydrogen bomb during the secret debate over the hydrogen bomb that Oppenheimer fervently opposed. But I didn't realize till that Borden was actually a liberal Democrat who actually supported Oppenheimer in a lot of political views, but they had such strong differences in other ways. And the point that I was going to make is, although Priscilla seems exceptionally strong in analyzing individuals and personalities and nuances of personality, what I really got out of her was her contextual analysis of institutions. And what really struck me, and which I remembered when she unfortunately passed away and when this invitation came back, literally close to 40 years after the conversation, is it was from talking to her that I began to finally comprehend the importance of the second lab story to the Oppenheimer case. And to those of you who aren't nuclear history aficionados, this was the challenge to Los Alamos in the early 1950s, led by Edward Teller and Ernest Lawrence and several of the other California West Coast physicists who didn't like Oppenheimer and who strongly believed in the hydrogen bomb. And it was from Priscilla that I began finally to learn, because I had really thought of the Oppenheimer, I read it, I am JRO, the telephone book size, declassified transcript of the security hearings I had read. But I hadn't sensed the extent to which, wrapped up in the California physicists' opposition to Oppenheimer, was also their sense that his successor to head Los Alamos, North Brother, and Oppenheimer were conspiring to sabotage, or at least slow down and not enthusiastically support the hydrogen bomb thermonuclear project in the early 1950s. And over the opposition of Oppenheimer's General Advisory Committee, which multiple times recommended against it, they convinced the Pentagon to authorize the creation of a completely new nuclear weapons laboratory that ended up being founded in Livermore, California, near to the home base of Teller and Lawrence. And later, after Lawrence died a few years later, it became the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory that exists to this day. And Priscilla found that absolutely crucial. In fact, one thing I was struck by reading her book, she writes on page 135, the country, she wrote this in 2005, the country now had two enormously costly laboratories competing with each other to produce ever more streamlined designs of nuclear weapons. Together, Livermore and Los Alamos created the vast arsenal of superfluous nuclear weaponry that curses us today. And she really integrated that into the story. Another thing that she does in her book, which of course came out after more than, well, actually 20 years after I got to know her in the mid 1980s, was the fracturing of the scientific community and the destruction of what she called the partnership between the American government and scientists. And of course, I had heard the stories about Teller, having a colleague not shake hands with him, and I had read about it far more anecdotally. But Priscilla really analyzes it and finds it a grievous result of the inquest against Oppenheimer, that you had a fracturing of what had been a fruitful collaboration. And she sees the downfall not only of Oppenheimer, but of other scientists who supported him and strongly opposed the escalation of nuclear arms as tragic, not because she firmly believes in a what-if counterfactual scenario that everything becomes hunky-dory in the Cold War, the nuclear arms race ends, but she believed that there was certainly much more of a chance of fruitful progress had the Oppenheimer what she regarded as the disastrous persecution of Oppenheimer, and what he stood for not taking place. In fact, in a paragraph where she writes about those scientists that like Hans Bethe, Victor Weisskopf, and some others who like fought for nuclear arms control in ensuing decades, even after the Oppenheimer security hearings in 1954. She writes that if anyone could have moderated man's rush to extermination, or at least articulated the danger with such eloquence that we would all have been forced to consider, it was Robert Oppenheimer. So my working hypothesis is that she was motivated by nuclear danger. In the end, this produced, as mentioned, The Ruin of J. Robert Oppenheimer came out in June. And again, this sort of surreal linkage with Marty Sherwin came out in the immediate, and I think it was a matter of a couple of months, after Marty Sherwin and Kai Bird produced their Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer, American Prometheus. And there are multiple reviews that praise Priscilla's book as very much complementing the Sherwin-Bird Oppenheimer book, because of course that covers his whole life and is not able to go into this story in as much depth. Of course, you know, Greg Herkin, Richard Polliner of Cornell. There's a handful of people who have deeply gone into the Oppenheimer inquest story. But Priscilla is, you know, certainly the author of an essential work on an iconic epical moment in the early Cold War and in American domestic politics, the intersection of the Cold War, nuclear history, and McCarthyism. Because, you know, this was just a couple of months before the Army McCarthy hearings finally toppled McCarthy and headed him, you know, out of the center of the story. Priscilla has really applied laser focus to this moment, and since she, like I, became obsessed with that story in the 1980s, she was able to find a number of surviving participants, and some of the encounters she has with them that she describes very well are absolutely fascinating and really add to the record beyond what one would know from some of the earlier great story like Philip Stern's book that came out in 1971. One more connection with Marty, I was just telling Mark, in preparation for this event, I only discovered something I had somehow missed because I'd gone on to other topics in my main historical work, most importantly Vietnam and Cuba. Just a few years ago, a new edition of Priscilla's The Ruin of J. Robert Oppenheimer came out with an introduction by Marty Sherwin. And now I am deeply curious to read that because Marty and I had endless conversations, but I never had one with him about Priscilla's book. So I'm extremely curious to know. And then, of course, they passed away within a few months of each other. And so, you know, it is really, you know, a sign of the passing of a giant generation to analyze how we got stuck in the nuclear mess that we're still in. Speaking of which, I just have to respond to one thing that Tom spoke about on behalf of Bill Lanouette, mentioning the Pseudoplatov episode of 1994, when this former Soviet spy had memoirs published, at least in his name, if his son composed a lot of it, that accused Oppenheimer and Niels Bohr and Enrico Fermi of being spies. And you know, Bill accurately remembered the outrage of those in the field, like David Holloway, who knew more than anyone else about Stalin and the bomb, as his book of that title came out that year. They really could sense that this was not an accurate charge. At the time, I ran the Cold War International History Project at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is still called that last time I checked. But Bill didn't mention it. Inspired by exactly what he described, I dedicated the next issue, which came out that fall, of the Cold War International History Project Bulletin to Soviet nuclear history, and got David Holloway and others to write about Soviet nuclear history on the basis of the newly available archival evidence. and to critically assess Pseudoplatov's book, and though to use the charge to get some new Soviet documents, including an interview of a Soviet intelligence agent with Niels Bohr just after World War II, which those who were more of a Pseudoplatov mindset held up and said, see, he did talk to him. And when the document was translated and evaluated by David Holloway, they thought, yes, he spoke to them, but he didn't say anything that wasn't in the Smythe report, which was the public US document issued right after the atomic bombing to give it the safe information. Maybe it wasn't so safe, but one can argue about that. But scientists were allowed to talk about whatever was in that report, but not what wasn't. So it at least stimulated ongoing historical investigation. In any case, I just want to conclude by, again, urging us all to read not only Priscilla's work, because I now have to go back, and I had assiduously stayed away from Assassination War because it was endless. Now I have to go read Marina and Lee and read the latest edition with updated footnotes. And also, of course, need to read the books of our panelists. But thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Let me just quickly, before I turn to Nick, just touch on a couple of things that Jim said. One is with regard to Marina and Lee, there will be copies of it available tomorrow, I believe, at the memorial service. So for those like Jim who haven't read it, you will be able to get a copy. I did, Priscilla long ago gave me a copy, so I actually read it long ago. But the other thing is Greg Hurricane, whose name's been mentioned by I think just about everyone, was one of the people who originally had really urged me to do a seminar here. He was going to take part. We were planning to have it in September when the memorial service was going to be then. And then that got postponed, I think, to November. And then the pandemic once again intervened. I'm very glad that this seminar is being held today, because I think if it were held a few weeks from now, there does seem to be some sort of resurgence here in Massachusetts that may have derailed it once again. At that point, I was going to give up. But, so the seminar today is partly the result of Greg Hurricane and Bill Lanowit, whose names have been mentioned here. I should add that there is a point on which Greg and Priscilla disagree with regard to Oppenheimer. That is the question of whether Oppenheimer had been a secret member of the Communist Party. One interesting thing is that subsequent to all that, that is in the late 2000s, around 2008 or 2009, I think it was, there were Soviet documents that emerged, very important Soviet intelligence documents that confirmed that Oppenheimer was not a spy. The Soviet Union was desperately trying to recruit him to be a spy, but he continually turned down, in fact, never even showed any interest in doing so. I think those documents, which I've looked at in detail, make very clear that the Pseudoplatov book in laying that out is really nonsense, and really quite pernicious nonsense. On the other hand, the Soviet documents do confirm what Greg Hurricane argues on the basis of US documents, or at least some memoir, I think it was, which he argued that Oppenheimer had been a secret member of the Communist Party. And that's exactly the way he is described in the Soviet documents. It refers to him as a secret member of the Communist Party. It doesn't suggest there's anything wrong with that. In fact, if anything, it's just a descriptor. It's not something that they're trying to say that this makes him subject to our influence. It's just a descriptor. But the Soviet documents make very clear that Oppenheimer is not a spy. And I think that whole line of argument initiated by the Pseudoplatov book can be put to an end. So let me turn next to please to Nick.
Well, you are all commenting on Priscilla's knowledge and ability to analyze situations in the Soviet Union. My relationship with Priscilla was on a much more personal basis than that. We crossed briefly in Moscow. I think she left a few months perhaps after I first arrived in 1961. And we renewed our friendship here in Cambridge many years later. For me, Priscilla was a very strong supporter, encourager to continue working on aspects of the Soviet Union. And so for that, I'm eternally grateful. And that's why I and my good wife here, Ruth, are here, because of Priscilla's warmth and her generosity and her willingness to go many steps beyond normal friendship. When I was working on a book about my imprisonment in Moscow, we were living then in Vermont, and there were certain historical things that I needed to know more about. And she said, let me know what books you want. I'll get them out of Widener. I'll bring them to you. And I said, well, then what will happen to these books? She said, well, you return them to me. I'll return them to Widener. And that sort of cooperation indeed worked. And very grateful for that. So I think, I've said the major things about my relationship with Priscilla, and I'll leave it there, but happy to answer any questions.
Okay, so let me pick up then on some of what Priscilla worked on. I should add that I was on a trip coming back from Prague a day or two ago, and there was, as we were getting off the plane, there was another passenger who mistakenly took his bag down and it whacked me in the face right in the nose. So I don't know whether my nose is bleeding now, but it has been intermittently during the day. But it certainly did a lot on the plane. But so if you do see my nose bleeding, just regard it as something more. So but Priscilla, as Nick was describing, had been based in the Soviet Union at a time when there were numerous trends going in conflicting directions. One was the so-called thaw, which was the cultural liberalization that began in the mid-50s and that continued really until a little bit after Khrushchev was ousted in October 1964. It continued in the early part of the Brezhnev period, but was mostly doomed by Khrushchev's ouster, and to some extent was already torpedoed earlier partly because of the reaction of the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, and then also this was his book on Ivan Denisovich, and but also because some of the figures within the Communist Party were worried that the thaw had become too much of a catalyst for social action. So even by the early 60s, when Khrushchev was still in power, there were problems beginning to emerge with the thaw. And Khrushchev nonetheless did proceed in October 1961 with the important next stage in de-Stalinization. So it gave the spur to the period that Priscilla covers in the book that she did on Soviet cultural affairs, which focuses mostly on 1962 to 64. And that book, which includes translations of various materials that were appearing at that time. That book, I think, has unfortunately largely been forgotten, but it's still worth looking at now, at least for those who want to think about a somewhat happier time in Russian history as well as in Soviet history. Is that that she does capture, I think, very well this interregnum that existed between the time when the thaw was still underway and ouster of Khrushchev and the subsequent clampdown that then became very harsh, starting in 1968 with the Prague Spring Soviet invasion. So so there was first that one, which actually came out later, but then the more other work I just want to discuss briefly has to do with Svetlana Alliluyeva. There were important figures that Priscilla lived with or knew very well. And this was part of her personality, is that she wouldn't bring these up normally. You know, she wouldn't, I learned only quite late that she had known, for example, George Kennan and Kennan's daughter and others, and had actually known them very well, you know, on almost, what should I put it, you know, familial basis. And that she had also known other important figures in the Soviet Union and as well as in the United States. And so one of these was Svetlana Alliluyeva. I just couldn't imagine what it had been like to work with her. Adam Ulam was the former director of the Russian Research Center, and who was the figure who had known Priscilla very well, first as a student in the early 1950s, and then later on for many years. Adam died in early 2000, but at some point, I think it was in 1996 or 97, he had mentioned to me, because I was asking him, he relied quite extensively on the Alliluyeva book. And I asked him about how that book had gotten produced, because I knew that he had interviewed her at some length on I think it was 12 or 15 occasions and interviewed Alliluyeva. So he said, oh, that was through Priscilla. He said Priscilla was one, and I hadn't realized at that point that Priscilla had lived with gotten to know Alliluyeva so well. So Priscilla and I had a long conversation about that, and that was instrumental in my going back and looking at the book again, because I hadn't looked at it in a long while. And if you look at so when I did go back and reread the book, I had a subsequent conversation with Priscilla about how, what the interaction was between them as they put out the book. And that's where that phrase, I don't recall, I think it was Max that Tom mentioned, had said about Priscilla wasn't quite sure who had been more difficult to work with, Marina Oswald or Svetlana Alliluyeva. And I think on the whole, it probably was Alliluyeva, but it was pretty stiff competition. The book, though, is again, you have to use it very judiciously and have to be aware of the vast amount of source material that's now available that wasn't available at the time the book came out. And perhaps some parts of it would have to be redone in the light of that source material. Nonetheless, it remains a very valuable book for those who want to understand the perspective of Svetlana Alliluyeva at a time when it was at a time when the thaw in the Soviet Union was coming to an end. It had basically ended. Khrushchev was already out of power. There was a repressive clampdown in the Soviet Union. So all of those circumstances have to be borne in mind, but nonetheless remains a valuable way of assessing that period. In subsequent years, I knew Priscilla from the mid-1980s until the time of her death. In subsequent years, Priscilla, I would say, was very pessimistic about the Soviet Union. Perhaps that experience had colored her perception in that, irrevocably. And it does account for why in the perestroika period under Gorbachev, initially she was, I think, quite skeptical that it would lead very far. But then certainly by 1988 or especially 1989, Priscilla became very, how should I put it? Maybe excited, maybe happy, but certainly optimistic that things were going to move in the right direction. And listen, she proved to be right about that. Certainly by the end of 1989, I remember when I was at her house on, I think it was New Year's Eve or maybe Christmas Day, around somewhere in between, I think, the two holidays. And so we were talking about that period, and I asked her whether, when she had been in the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 1960s, she ever anticipated that such a turn of events could happen. And she said, absolutely not. So I think that, from the perspective of someone who had been there through initial period of relative liberalization and then during a period of a clamp down, and that faced numerous disappointments during the period that she was alive, but not in the Soviet Union, but still during the Soviet period, that she had reason, I think, to be skeptical. Now, what I've wondered in recent weeks, the last 10 weeks or so, is what her reaction would be to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think that here too, she, after a period of 30 years in which the Soviet Union was gone, that she would have felt that it was sort of the reverse of what she had experienced with the Soviet Union. She wasn't terribly optimistic about post-Soviet Russia, and I think that at this point she would feel that some of that disinclination to be too buoyant about the prospects of Russia had been justified. Just as earlier, from the early 50s on, when she had begun studying the Soviet Union, that she had always had this degree of wariness, even as she was hoping that things might move in the right direction. Okay, so
I
please.
wonder if I could just add a quick comment there, and that is that she seemed to have some sort of problem with the KGB. I'm not quite sure what it was specifically, but she felt that the KGB was intruding into her work. And when she left Moscow, when was it? Not beautiful.
So that would have been 62.
Yeah, something like that. She came here, but I always felt that she blamed the KGB really for interrupting her work in Moscow. Her work in Moscow was a bit off of the mainstream, I would say. She was not accredited for any important news organization. She actually had an accreditation from the Foreign Ministry for the North Atlantic NANA Newspaper Association, which, from the point of view, my point of view, I was looking for UPI at the time. That was basically a know-nothing organization. And I imagine that, and maybe some of you know something about this, but I imagine that she got paid about $25 per article, I think, and that hardly covered any expenses for her. She was living in the Metropole Hotel, and I think it was largely self-financed. She left, and you may know, did not return to the Soviet Union for decades. Tanya, do you remember anything about that?
Not much, but as you speak, things come to my mind that I may be able to share if
Right.
with Mark's permission.
She, it was as if I had the impression that she felt that the KGB had intruded far too much in her life, and she didn't want to have anything more to do with that organization. And she didn't go back to the Soviet Union or Russia for a long, long time. I'm talking, what, 20 years or so?
Until perestroika, I think.
Yeah, I mean, part of it was that, you know, she just routinely maintained ties to the US Embassy in Moscow, because in case she was captured or arrested by the KGB. And so, but she had, you know, again, she was very interested in cultural affairs, mostly literature in the Soviet Union, although also theater, and in the Soviet Union. And so she developed very friendly relationships with certain cultural figures. And that, I think, also generated suspicion. When she was asked by the embassy to meet with Lee Harvey Oswald during the time he was seeking to defect to this Soviet Union, and that too, I think, generated suspicion on the part of some KGB officers that maybe she wasn't entirely who she claimed to be. So there were reasons, you know, perfectly innocent reasons, but ones that for a morbidly suspicious organization like the KGB would come across as potentially warranting greater surveillance of her. And again, Priscilla discussed this, you know, certain things she wrote is about the surveillance that she did feel all the time when she was in the Soviet Union. And she said that, at least I believe I think it's in the book on Soviet cultural affairs, that it was often difficult to work on literature in the Soviet Union because of that pervasive surveillance. So so that's why I think that she was so reluctant to go back. It would make me reluctant too. I should add, you know, my first time in the Soviet Union was way back when I was very young, in 1983. I hated it so much, I vowed I would never go back. And it took me 3 years before I could go back.
Now you
And,
go
I
to.
still didn't like it. But then by the late 80s, you know, 1988, especially 1989, it was the most exciting place to be. So that's why with Priscilla, you know, her view too changed by that. I think after having felt there was such a stifling dictatorship, which of course it was when she was there, and that her view became very optimistic by the end. So, okay, please.
Hi, I'm Susan Miller Havens, and I belong to the kitchen table group in Priscilla's home for.
Speaking of kitchen tables,
since-
please. I'm gonna force it down.
So since the 1980s, and there are at least 3 or 4 people here who've sat for hours and hours. One of the things about Priscilla was she was a true reporter. She didn't want to write something unless she knew the facts. But when you sat with her over time, she would tell you, she would personalize it. She was not going to personalize it in her work. So in terms of the KGB, she told me on many occasions what it was like when they came to the coffee shop and would say, we're not going to let you leave, or we're not letting you back in. But it was a taunting. And, you know, and again, Priscilla she was modest. She wasn't, you know, she said, I was doing my job. I couldn't stand it. The other thing, Pebble Gifford and I, who's to my right, and I worked over her so many times, we just couldn't get her to do it. One night we were talking about, I naively asked her why Jack Ruby was allowed to come into the police station whenever he felt like it. And Priscilla said, oh, Susan, you don't know anything about Dallas. I said, no, I don't know anything about Dallas. Okay. And she said, well, then let me tell you about Ruby and his relationship with Johnson. And, you know, and then Pebble said, all right, I mean, this isn't in the book. Can we, you know, let's rewrite it. And the thing is that we often wanted to tape record Priscilla. because we missed, there were so many pearls that we got when we sat with her, and yet we adored her and we respected her and we would never tape record her worst fear, right? But there was a huge story about Lyndon Johnson and Ruby. And she wasn't going to tell it. And the reason she wasn't going to tell it was because she didn't feel she knew the facts. But she was a true journalist. And that was one of the things that we loved and respected about her. And although she did leave this good earth with an awful lot of information.
Can you give us a few details of what that relationship was, even though it may be an imperfect retelling?
Well, I mean, she said Jack Ruby owned Dallas, for one thing. What she didn't, Pamela, do you remember what she didn't tell us was what was the relationship between Lyndon Johnson and Ruby? And what was why was Ruby needing to go and do that assassination then?
Well, it was vengeance, wasn't it? It was
Yeah.
retribution.
Just raw vengeance, yeah. So I don't know what the connection is. I don't know enough about Lyndon B.
I don't, we've all given very good credit to Priscilla's scholarly contributions, which are enormous, but I don't think we've really talked about her struggle. I mean, come the 22nd of November, every year, she would become very tense and upset, and invariably she'd be receiving letters or articles would be sent to her, which were very upsetting because she never had, the recognition. People were suspicious of her. And I
Yeah,
think
no,
that was, and it took her 13 years to write that book.
Yeah.
And, my relationship with Priscilla was not scholarly. I mean, we used to sit together a lot. I would ask her questions and sort of silly questions, I'd say, well, what do you really think? Did Oswald, assassinate Kennedy? And she said, no. She would laugh. She had a wonderful sense of humor. She said, no, he couldn't even cross the road on his own.
With the venom that was directed against Priscilla.
It was really very ugly.
It's really vile.
I wonder if, at least on this, just on this point, and I wonder if Tom has a response to this, and I don't know whether this makes sense or not, but I wonder if the very strength of her book, in a sense, almost feeds the conspiracy. What I mean by that, I think we latch on to conspiracies because they help make sense of the world. And they give us the sense that great events must have great meaning. And it must be, you can't simply have a situation where the disaffected Oswald, who happens to work right where the motorcade is going to pass and slow down, decides to do this, that somehow can't be a sufficient explanation for this. And that, as she said, I think maybe in a subsequent interview, Tom, she doubts he would have gone across town to do what he did that fateful day. So I just kind of wonder if far from responding to conspiracy theorists, she almost fueled their sense that it can't be the way she described it. I don't know.
Well, there were reports that she was connected with the CIA, and she was attacked for that. And one of the questions that I'd like to put to all of you, because I couldn't find the answer to it, how did this come about? That a connection with the CIA was talked about.
Can't blame someone.
Well, my father was in the CIA and my father was David Davenport. And she brought Marina to live with David Davenport while she was avoiding the heat. Now, he was out of the CIA at that point. But I think that definitely has fueled a lot of speculation, at least what I've seen online, was that there was thoughts that my father was her handler. That was one thing.
Wasn't there in some degree in Moscow, I think you said she wasn't a mainstream UPI type, right? She was, so her source of support was personal, but I could easily see the KGB saying, gee, this is who's supporting this person? If it's not, could be this yet. I mean, you know what I mean? So it's like she seems set up for that in a sense. And perhaps other forms of distrust of her background stem from that same thing. What was she doing there? You know, it's not typical, you know, just to go as a cub reporter and pay your own way and all that.
I was gonna say, I mean, to me, it's obviously she was involved with American intelligence, but to be,
In what way do you mean?
just as, if you're an American businessman, and you go over to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is your place of interest, you're gonna be approached by the CIA to gather information, or an intelligence organization to gather information, whether you say yes, whether you say no. I believe that she did. I believe that she was sent to interview Oswald because she was someone who was gonna ask them the questions she wanted, that they wanted to know the answers to. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's a bad thing that she may have been involved in the intelligence services. I mean, if you've
But
ever.
this is your surmise.
This is my surmise after meeting her and knowing what had happened. When you talk to Priscilla, she's a great person. Obviously, she's a wonderful person. But whenever you talk to her, you want to ask her a question about something she knew, she would always turn it back. Well, what do you think? And it was always like, you'd end up telling her more about yourself than she would tell you about her. And you'd feel like at the end of the conversation, you're like, wow, she's really interesting, but you didn't really get the information you wanted. And I'm saying this not as a criticism, not as a criticism at all, but I mean, it just, there's too many coincidences, and I don't think there's a conspiracy to kill Kennedy. Personally, I think anyone who thinks there is a conspiracy is a moron, but that's my personal opinion. But she has, I don't think she has anything to do with that. I think just her, you know, she was a right place, right time person in many cases. But I don't, you know, but to say, I mean, that's my opinion. Just from talking to her and what I know about the Kennedy assassination, which I've read hundreds and hundreds of books.
Yeah, as I said before, I deliberately decided not to go down the rabbit hole of Kennedy assassination theories and conspiracies. So I'm not an expert. But Mark knows I'm also a document fetishist. And if you're not aware, and if you're curious about this point, there's an organization called maryfarrell.org that has the millions of pages of documents that have been declassified, in some cases partially redacted with things blacked out, and they're all searchable. And just for the heck of it, the other night, I typed in Priscilla Johnson McMillan, and it not only linked to like an 8-part essay called Priscilla and Lee, and a specific essay on Priscilla and the CIA and what the evidence says and doesn't say, but it links to hundreds of documents, because in the aftermath of the assassination, certainly, there was obviously intense CIA interest in her and her relationship with Oswald. But if you want to read actual documents, I recommend you go to the site called maryfarrell.org. I can spell it, things. Yeah, MARYFERRELL.
All one word.
Yeah, all one word. And if you just go into Google, you'll get linked right to it.
You sure it's not .com?
I think it's .org, but if you just type Mary Farrell, you'll get it.
Who would Mary Farrell?
She's a philanthropist of some kind, and she created a website about assassinations that has multiple, but the key thing is, due to Oliver Stone's movie, JFK, which had the wacky conspiracy theory of Johnson and the CIA conspiring to come there, that led to legislation passed by Congress in the early 1990s, JFK administration, which led to the declassification of hundreds of thousands of documents from various agencies, including things like intercepts that normally are completely tabooed and declassified. And they were supposed to all be fully declassified a couple of years ago, after 25 years, and Trump declassified more. However, they found various loopholes to delay the full declassification. Actually, one of the key documents with Priscilla is her testimony before House Assassinations, 1978, and I think something like the first 40 pages of it are still blacked out. Who the hell knows? But yeah, I'm not taking a position one way or the other. All I'm suggesting is if you're curious and would like to read documents, that's a way to search for them. And after a while, they'll probably hit you subscribe to them, especially if you wanted nice PDFs that you can print out, the old fashioned way. But that's a way if you'd like to read documentation on the subject.
And as Jim mentioned, immense numbers of documents released, some of which are only at best tangentially related to
Very
assassination. But they're nonetheless extremely interesting documents there, for example, the FBI's penetration of the American Communist Party.
And covert operations against Cuba, which are extremely interesting.
It may also be worth indicating that I think it was in a 2013 interview in the Atlantic, if I remember correctly. The interviewer said to Priscilla, just for the record, have you had any connections with the CIA? And she offered a one-word answer, which was no. That's I think 2013.
Yeah, and as I say, of course, it was routine for U.S. intelligence personnel and diplomatic personnel to ask visitors to the Soviet Union about the impressions. That didn't mean they had ties to the CIA.
And to need to find ties. Doesn't mean they were an asset.
Some of them would answer questions, but in a perfectly innocent way. There were some who agreed to be regular informants, but I don't know of any indication that Priscilla did that. Tatiana, did you? Tatiana? Okay, yeah, please, over to you.
Was a friend of Priscilla's and sort of a nephew. I can't really explain my relationship, but I sat with Priscilla in her backyard, having glasses of wine any number of times, and I always got to a point of being indiscreet and asking her directly these questions. And finally, one night, I don't believe she worked for the CIA, but she told me that the research agency that she worked for in New York when she was working for Jack Kennedy did work for the CIA. So that's the only connection I ever got out of her.
Yeah, I think it did some contract work for the CIA. I don't think it was actually a front organization.
Right.
That's my recollection. I need to check that. Please.
I think my suspect that Priscilla had a mission to tell the story. And I asked her why she wanted to tell the story. And she said, because, the assassination was such a shock to the American psyche that, because people want to believe in a conspiracy, as we see today, everybody wants to believe in a conspiracy. And she wanted to show us that this little schmuck of a man who wasn't terribly bright had done it. She wanted to show the world that, because she didn't want to get into all the conspiracy stuff because she didn't believe it.
So, Tom or Fred, do you want to?
I have a couple of thoughts. One is, it's my understanding that the KGB essentially tries to recruit everybody. And they're very energetic about it, and they spend a lot of time on it. And Priscilla was one of the people who was pressed. Susan's description of them approaching her in a coffee shop rings a bell. I remember hearing stories of that kind. It went on the whole time she was there. And her belief was that the reason why they let her, comparatively speaking, let her alone, and didn't actually bring the hammer down, was because Khrushchev defended her. Somehow Khrushchev had taken a fancy to Priscilla. Some function, something like that, and he protected her. That was her belief. She thought that was the case. And one other thing, the connection with CIA or something. If you go into certain fields, everybody has a connection to the CIA. It's just, it can't be avoided. When Priscilla got out of college, she actually applied to join the CIA as a research assistant in some
She told me that.
department or other. And then that fell apart. The amount of documentation about that failed employment effort is astounding in its extent. And the people back and forth trying to weigh exactly the motive. Is she really trustworthy? We could offer her a job if she wanted a job, but she doesn't want a job. That's that kind of stuff, just endlessly. And to devote a part of your life to reading the documentation that they had generated about Priscilla would be to lose the rest of it. Trust me.
Oh, I just wonder, if anyone finds highly implausible the idea that the great Nikita Khrushchev would take an interest in a mid-20s American who is just traipsing around, I highly recommend Marvin Kalb's memoirs that have appeared in the last couple of years, because he was about Priscilla's age in Moscow at exactly the same time.
Yeah, they knew each other.
And Nikita Khrushchev took an interest in him. And he called him Peter the Great because of his height, and his name wasn't Peter.
Yeah, I remember one time when Marvin and Priscilla and two other people and I got dinner at the SNS restaurant, which is just down the street.
Yeah.
And they were talking about their time in Soviet Union in the early 60s. And because they were sometimes doing overlapping stories there. So Priscilla, I think, felt that because she knew both of the cab drivers, at that time, she felt that they had basically been a little more positive about the Soviet Union than she was. I mean, she said that her experience there really soured her on the prospect for positive change in the Soviet Union. And for a long time, she proved to be right about that. Please. Did she have no relationship with just to your left?
Pebble.
I heard something that conflicts a little bit with what she told me. I'm Pebble Gifford, by the way. One of the Higgett Street hellions she was from. And, causing some sort of trouble. With her agreement, she would participate. About how she happened to go interview Oswald. And I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about that. I heard somebody say that the American Embassy had sent her. She told me that the New York Times had sent her to go interview Oswald because they had interviewed him prior to her going to interview him. And I'm just wondering, clarifying that. If
I'd say neither of those are true.
Neither are true.
The American Embassy told her that Oswald was in the same hotel that she was in, and that he was available. She could go ahead and talk to him.
That's how she happened to.
That's how she happened to do it. And she did it, the same day. And curiously, I once sat at a lunch next to John McVicker. And John McVicker was the embassy officer that told her that Oswald was in the Metropole Hotel and sort of set it up. And he described very clearly that he didn't send her there. There was nothing like that going on. She used to go into the embassy pretty much every day or very often just to check in and be visible. And she knew all the officers there, and people would give her tips about things that were important or interesting or she should make fun of.
Yeah, I mean, it was an odd.
What
part of the embassy?
So the embassy had.
Who did
suggested-
McVicker work for?
He worked for the State Department.
It was State
The
Department.
Warren Commission spent a lot of time trying to make sure that he didn't work for the CIA, and he did.
I should add that, it was a very odd situation in which you had a US citizen who wanted to defect to the Soviet Union. So it wasn't something the embassy routinely handled. It was a very unusual situation. And that's why I think that he suggested that she might want to speak with him because he wasn't quite sure how to handle it.
If I can just add to that, at that time, we're talking about 61, 62, there were at least 3 Americans who wanted to defect to the Soviet Union, give up their American citizenship. Oswald was one, but there were several others as well. So it was a known phenomenon. And of course, for a journalist to speak in depth with an American who is giving up his passport, his nationality, to join the Soviet Union. It's crazy. And therefore, there's a story here.
So you're saying
No, I see
that
it.
how did
Okay,
she
please,
happen to go in that hotel and interview him? You're saying the word came from, she just knew about it through the.
She talked to Mick Vicker, and Mick Vicker said, there's a guy here who's trying to defect. And there was a lot of complications about it, whether or not the Russians were going to accept him. And she was interested in going to do it.
And
She lived in the hotel.
The vicar's
They
role
both
at the
lived in a
time was
hotel,
what?
and they both paid the same rate for their rooms, which was $3 a day.
But the vicar's role at the time, he told her about Oswald being there, was what? This,
Well, he didn't write about that at the time, but he was thoroughly interviewed about that after Kennedy was killed.
and what was his role? Was he in the hotel or in
No,
Moscow?
he was in the embassy.
was
McVicker
in
was
the
in the embassy, and she saw him there, and he, in effect, told her there was a story there, and she went over there, and she spent 5 hours interviewing Oswald that night, and she took very copious notes. And a couple of years ago, I was at Priscilla's house one day, and she handed me a sheaf of paper, and she said, I have a question I want to ask. I'm not sure what I should do with these. And it was her notes of her interview with Oswald. And it was a thick sheet of paper, very precisely, neatly, done, but it was not a casual thing at all. It's like she already started to write a book. That was her given way, I think, to approaching any subject. Very, very deep dive, indeed.
Do you know what she used them herself for her book, of course, but did she dispose of those papers in any
She
way?
didn't dispose. I think they're in the Library of Congress or some other collection that has a lot of her papers.
Okay.
And exactly why it's that particular place. And she didn't actually move them to a new place or take them up from one person and give it to another.
But they ended up.
Just had them in the basement.
Any investigations?
They all have-
I wondered if I could turn the conversation back to the issue of the ruin, the book, The Ruin of J. Robert Oppenheimer. I'm Sarah Dundas. I'm one of Priscilla's nieces, and I'm very interested in that question of the fracturing of the collaboration of science and the politicians. Partly because I think Priscilla had a hugely important message there that did not get the press that it deserved, or the recognition in our society, but also partly because it is a somewhat confusing subject. I mean, the extent to which that collaboration already existed prior to the hearing, it seems to me to have been relatively tenuous. And
Well, of course, she's referring to the cooperation of the Manhattan Project.
Yeah,
And the
well,
RSVD, the
yes,
World War II
and maybe the
cooperation was
interim
extensive.
committee. But I think the scientists felt a huge sense of obligation to be able to recommend further on policy, at least many of them did. And that there was a potential perhaps for scientific advisors to be involved in a more meaningful way in relation at least to presidential policy and thinking, which maybe was destroyed by the hearing. But I guess I just wondered if you would say a little bit more about your thoughts on.
Well, sure. Well, I mean, the hearing ratified the obstruction. I mean, really, it was the overruling of Oppenheimer, the GAC, the General Advisory Committee to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission's recommendation against a crash program to build the hydrogen bomb in response to the Soviets breaking the American atomic monopoly on August 29, 1949. Truman, backed by Secretary of Defense Johnson and Secretary of State Acheson, who had formerly been sympathetic to international control, they agreed that, hey, if the Soviets might be working on this, and it was revealed at exactly the same moment that Klaus Fuchs had been a Soviet spy. He was a German-born communist who was part of the British delegation to Los Alamos in 1944-45. They decided, well, then we have to build it. And that was deeply depressing to Oppenheimer and the General Advisory Committee that had voted virtually unanimously, and I say virtually because one member, Glenn Seaborg, of the 9 was out of the country, and so didn't. But the other 8, including Harvard President James Conant, all strongly advised on strategic, technical, scientific, and implicitly moral grounds that the US should not build what they openly called a weapon of genocide. And when they were overruled, that really was the sign that, as Marty Sherman used to say, that the viewpoint that prevailed was that those scientists should be on cap, not on top. In other words, their job was to build the most powerful weapons that they could, and it was up to the elected officials and their bureaucratic representatives to decide what to do with them. And of course, something similar happened in the Soviet Union, with Andrei Sakharov a few years later, would be highly disillusioned by the testing of massive thermonuclear weapons, despite the danger of fallout. So, already the scientists had been very reticent to participate in policy. The scientists, the Scientific Advisory Committee to the Interim Committee that recommended using the atomic bomb on Japan in the summer of 1940, chaired by Oppenheimer, and this is one of the appendices to Marty Sherman's book, by the way, explicitly forswore that they as scientists had any special right to influence policy. They were just expressing, and held back from recommending any alternative to the use of the bomb that was in fact recommended by the Interim Committee. On the other hand, as Alice Kimball Smith, who some of you might have known, who was a good friend of Priscilla's, decades ago, she wrote a book, A Peril and a Hope, which is I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but that's one of the best books about the rise of the atomic scientist movement after World War II, and that was really to push in favor of international control of the atomic bomb. And the failure of that debate, that was cleared by the end of 1946, although there were a few efforts in 1947 that I've written about that ironically, Oppenheimer would be accused of more probably than not being a Soviet spy in the famous letter from William Borden to J. Edgar Hoover in the fall of 1953. But in 1947, Oppenheimer had actually been more anti-Soviet than the Truman administration and had unsuccessfully urged the Truman administration to break off negotiations with the United Nations for international control of atomic energy, because he said the Soviets couldn't be trusted. Which is kind of odd behavior if you're a Soviet spy and you're trying to, influence policy in a more sympathetic direction to the Soviet Union. But the scientists were already on the defensive. They were already being investigated for allegedly allowing nuclear isotopes to be sent insecurely to other countries. There had already been an effort to cut off nuclear cooperation with Britain after the war because of the revelation of British involvement in Soviet spying against the Manhattan Project. So, it hadn't gotten far, but as Priscilla, wrote with admiration, there were certain figures who avidly tried to do whatever they could to alert the public to nuclear danger, although she also stresses Oppenheimer himself, because of his security clearance, was completely pushed down on to prevent him from speaking out explicitly about nuclear policy. And, so he was really trapped in a very uncomfortable position. But, I'd be glad to email with you and talk to you about, some of the great literature that exists on this.
Fred, you brought up something that I've actually never thought about, but given the ongoing question of what Kennedy would have done in Vietnam, I'm curious what her research suggested to him.
Well, I think, I think, 53, there's a paradox with respect to Kennedy and Vietnam, which I've written some about and will write about in the second volume, which is that I think his doubts about the prospects for any Western military intervention were deep. They were formed in part by his own visit in 51, when he thought, and he said, and he wrote in his diary that he kept, and also said to an audience here in Boston after he returned, basically the French are not going to win, and by extension, no Western power is going to win in that part of the world. I think Priscilla's research effort in the spring of 53 deepened that sense. So in a way, I think she contributes to this gloom that he feels about the prospects for the West. The paradox, of course, is that even though, in my view, that's, and Jim and I have talked about this a lot, even though that skepticism on Kennedy's part, I think, never goes away. Right up until the end in Dallas, I think some part of it feels that, a big part of it feels that. He nevertheless expands U.S. involvement quite dramatically on his watch, and especially in 1962. So in the middle year of his short administration. So I have to figure out how to resolve that paradox. I have suggested with respect to the counterfactual. In my judgment, though we can never know, the best argument about what surviving John F. Kennedy would have done in Vietnam has not taken the course that Lyndon Johnson felt. That is to say, I think he would have avoided a large-scale Americanization of the war. So Priscilla and I talked about that. I think she shared that view, and she said to me that she shared that view. She made a very interesting observation on this. She said to me, without my prompting, and she had no particular inside knowledge of this. This was just her impression of things, but that Johnson, though he had his own doubts about the war, Kennedy's doubts went deeper, and Johnson, as she put it, in domestic political terms, this was more important to Johnson because he was thinking already about the '64 election, obviously when he would be elected in his own right for the first time, and then maybe even looking ahead to '68. She was really, really interesting on this topic and so many others, whether or not she had, particular expertise on the matter. It was just a delight to spend time with her. And I had plans to do much more interviewing of Priscilla, but that's my take on the Vietnam question.
Brenda, I have to say I'm more skeptical. But I look forward to volume 2, so please back here.
Yes. Historians are often struggling to weigh the impact of structural forces
Yes.
in defining the course of events versus the abilities of individuals to affect outcomes. And I'm curious, as you think about Priscilla's body of work, either where she landed on some of those on that question, or what her work speaks to you about with respect to that question.
I'll just make a quick observation, and then others can speak. I think she felt that human agency matters, and that the decisions made by individual leaders have an enormous effect, which isn't, I think she was sophisticated. She understood that there was also, as you point out, structural causes, and that often we have to think of them together. But it's a really interesting question you ask. And I would say, I don't know how others feel about this, but that Priscilla understood the role that individuals can play, and not just leaders, of course. Oswald, as she shows beautifully in the book, the inconsequential figure, has this unbelievable effect on not only his nation, but in a sense, the world. I think about this quite a lot. I'm from Sweden originally, and I was barely born at the time of the assassination. But my parents who have passed would tell me about the crushing blow that it was for them in little Sweden, Scandinavia, when they learned that the president, it wasn't the president, John F. Kennedy was the president. And it's on account of Oswald, as she shows. So I would say that she puts a lot on human agency.
And exactly as you mentioned before, if you'd have to go across Dallas to take the initiative of the murder, he probably wouldn't have done it. It's just that he happened to be working in the area. So please, Jim and Tom.
Yeah, I unfortunately didn't have those glasses of wine in the backyard with her. So I have no idea how she would articulate it, but her work on Oppenheimer shows clearly that she's conscious of both influences, that individuals can matter, and contingent events can matter, but so do structural and larger forces. And part of the beauty of that book is you can see her balancing those things, it's, I think she clearly understood that history is a very complex nuance that combines contingent individual forces and broader systemic and structural forces. But I think she enjoyed writing about the individuals more than she enjoyed writing about the larger forces.
I mean, my sense is that when it came to the Soviet Union, she felt that even though individuals mattered, the system was fundamentally what made it, such an unpleasant and difficult to cooperate with place. But so I think that maybe when it came to a dictatorship like the Soviet Union, she placed somewhat less emphasis on individuals, although even there too, she, as I say, by the late Soviet period, she was placing a great deal of emphasis on individuals. But even earlier, some of her contacts with cultural figures that they could matter. She attached a great deal of importance, I think rightly, to the role of culture in Russia and in the Soviet Union, that she felt it actually did affect people's lives in a way that political leaders could, in a positive way, that political leaders could.
I'll just say briefly that my favorite piece of her writing, bar none, is her piece about Pasternak's funeral from Harper's, which I commend to anyone who has not read it.
Please.
I just want to echo your comment. I had the privilege of living with Priscilla for 2 years. While I was studying at a different Harvard institution. But those are the years where Andropov died. And Chernenko came in, Chernenko died, and Gorbachev came in. It was a very topsy-turvy time at 12 Hilliard Street. I would arrive and there would be any number of people, maybe some of you, sitting in the living room. And she was always dining people with chocolates and strawberries and whatever kind of liqueur she might have. But she was intensely suspicious of perestroika. She didn't know if it would last. And she was especially suspicious of the KGB and the institution that it represented in Russia to recenter Russia back to, I'll say, where it is today, to the point where a couple of years ago, she mentioned to me quietly on the side, she said, I asked her what she thought about what was going on in Russia at the time. She said, well, I worry terribly about Putin. He's a KGB agent, and that's a problem. That the hardliners are going to come back in, the hardliners are going to take control of Russia again, and that it would revert to where it had been all the way back to 1984 when I first got to Cambridge. So I think the institutions really mattered to her. She understood as well the importance of the people around the institutions and how they go. So I think the melding of the two is important, but as to Russia, she understands the institutions are probably driving a lot that's there.
It's interesting to speculate on, in light of what all three of you are saying, about how she would respond to the situation today.
It sounds like I'm sorry.
No, just to finish the thought, because I talked about this with my student in the last class last week. It's arguably, the current situation is arguably an affirmation of the great man theory of history, because of Putin's importance in terms of what's happening, individual importance, but also Zelensky. That I don't know where Ukraine would be absent Zelensky, but it's clear that he's made an enormous difference to what the country has been able to do thus far, but also which matters. It's fascinating to know what Priscilla would say.
I was just gonna say what he said is something that Priscilla was very prescient about, because if you read Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, she diagrams in great detail how the KGB knew what was gonna happen, knew that the Soviet Union as it was gonna fall apart, and they prepared themselves by salting money away all over Europe and places where they couldn't find it. And when they had the chance, Putin was their guy. And now you see half of those oligarchs are KGB, and basically the KGB took over the country when Yeltsin stepped down and handed over to Putin.
I mean, the basic problem though was Yeltsin, in that he never dismantled the KGB and left it there. It was renamed initially the Ministry of Security and then the Federal Counterintelligence Service and then the Federal Security Service. But it was Yeltsin who made the choice to leave it in place. And I think that was a fundamental mistake. Please,
If I may comment on that specific thing, I once had Priscilla over to my place for dinner.
oh, let me very quickly.
Oh, okay,
This is
I can
Tatiana
introduce.
Yankelevich,
Yes.
who is the daughter of Yelena Bonner and the
And
stepdaughter
stepdaughter
of
of
Andrei
Andrei
Sakharov.
Yes, and I have, it's important to understand how I came to know Priscilla. It was much later than most of you who have known her. As you were talking, it's like puzzle came together. Because I can hear, of course, I knew about her interest in culture of the thought, of the Ottipik, and her time being there in those years. And of course, I knew all about her connection with Harvey Lee Oswald and Marina. And but the way I met her is through Edward Klein, whose name may be known to most of people here. And as you were talking, I was thinking that, as I was listening to all of you, I was thinking that that comes in a kind of a gang of friends that includes Max Hayward. And I wonder if Max Hayward introduced Priscilla to Ed Klein, or was it the other way around?
I think it was the other way.
Yeah, that's what I thought, because of the Chekhov publishing company that Ed by that time acquired and kind of salvaged. And so I met Priscilla at Ed Klein's home in New York, and then we learned that we are neighbors basically, and many years later in the 90s, I think, when Ed and Jill Klein came over to Boston to visit some friends, one of the most prominent one of which was Priscilla. I knew Priscilla by then already, and I invited them all for dinner. And Priscilla, one thing was very touching, when she kept saying that my Russian is not what it used to be, and I really can't follow what your mom says, because my mom spoke in Russian with Ed, and so Jill and Priscilla were talking between themselves, and I was kind of in between all of them to tie them all together. But it was remarkable, and of course, Ed and my mother, they used to argue about intentions and possible outcomes of where Russia is going. And my mother was always very pessimistic, and she insisted on opening Ed's eyes because he was such a well-wisher. He wanted to take, the desired for the actual. At least that's how she felt. That's how she her took on Ed. And I remember Priscilla listening and kind of getting part of the Russian, and the other part I tried to translate to her in a kind of a digest manner. And I could feel that she's more on the side of my mother. And now what you're talking, what I hear here confirms my impression, because I wasn't quite sure at the time where Priscilla stands. I just liked her as a human being, which actually takes me to I think, a very important part that came out so strongly about her humanity, which I think was the most important common denominator to everything she has done. And I'm so heartened to hear confirmation from people who knew her professionally that it matters to them. And I know that she also absolutely agree with her kind of historical outlook that a single human being matters, and her modesty was incomparable, and she would think that she's really intellectually and in every other way so much below the level of people that she spoke to. And perhaps some of you felt that too. And I remember when I was talking to her, I thought that this is a really font of knowledge and understanding. And she looks up to me for my opinion. And the question that you have quoted, what do you think about it? I was humbled, a young woman, or much younger than Priscilla. It was really heartening. And so Help Humanity is really underwrote everything she did. And I was in this very room when she gave a seminar on the book on Oppenheimer, and it was just, for me, it was so eye-opening. And
It was hard to get her to do it. I hosted that seminar.
Pardon?
I hosted that seminar, and it's hard to get her to do it. She was.
Yes,
so
I
reluctant to
remember.
speak in public.
Because she was so demanding of herself, and she never thought that she really knows. So many of you who spoke about that, Susan, it's absolutely remarkable. And I mean,
Just very quickly, the
I
three
miss her so
people that
much.
Tatiana
Yeah.
mentioned too,
Mhm.
Ed Klein, Max Haywood, and Priscilla, they all had the common feature that they did a great deal of translation. Priscilla early on in the fifties and sixties, and then Max Haywood and Ed Klein throughout. their
Yeah, and to
lives.
go
And
to.
and that was something that I remember hearing them all discuss. And,
Unfortunately, I haven't met Max Hayward, whose work I absolutely adore, and but it didn't happen because he passed away not shortly, but fairly soon after I arrived in this country. I remember Ed and Jill going to visit him when he was already terminally ill, just basically to say goodbye. Now, I just want to say, quote something that Jill Klein and I talked about very often, and she always said, well, Priscilla, she is a real lady, which is completely true. In every way that she's so soft-spoken, but she has firm convictions. She never offends anyone. She's always kind to people. It's just remarkable. And another thing that I'm trying to remember, Jill used to say, oh yeah, that this young lady in a time that is so precarious for an American in the Soviet Union, she was so brave. And I don't think I want to say foolhardy, because she was not. I think she understood as much as any young American of the time could where she's going. And yet she went. She was remarkably brave. And the most remarkable thing to me is that she always stood her ground there. And what I hear about KGB coming up to her in the cafe and all that, it's just absolutely, people would run away, scared like hell. And she did not break, she did not bend, and she stayed and did what she felt she should. And I'm really heartbroken when I hear people from that side, people that I know and professionally respect, who say that, oh, but wasn't she a CIA, like very dismissively? And even if she were, well, I mean, what the difference does it make? But she wasn't, and it just upsets me very much. But yeah, just it's a shame, that we no longer have her around.
Okay, let me, because we have only about 20 more minutes, so if people want to raise questions, please do so. Otherwise, I'm going to go back to the panelists and ask them if they have final thoughts. Please.
I've known Priscilla for 45 years, and I learned something about her last year that I had never heard before. And it is that Priscilla was harassed by more than one country. And I learned it from a lady that I just met a year ago, whose name was Tatiana, and her last name was Sloan. And she has a very rich Soviet Union background. because she married a professor named David Sloan. I don't know, sorry. And she had no intention of coming to this country except as his wife. And they spent most of the rest of the years being in a number of colleges, including Williams College and Tufts. But she said, I said to her, I want you to meet Priscilla. And she said, well, I heard that name, but I only heard it once. She says, on the day I came into this country, which was in the late 60s, she had to do what every Russian or every other arrival at this country, she had to undergo an interrogation by the FBI about people that were important to the FBI, and whether she knows them. And she said I said I wanted her to meet Priscilla. She says, I heard her name only once. And that was when I was being interviewed as to whether I was a proper purpose to be here. And it was, among other things, you know, Priscilla, and she said no, and I haven't heard her name since then. And she says, I always remember it because it was such an important time for me. And I was able to say her that tell them that she knew Priscilla McMillan. She didn't know Priscilla McMillan and never heard it again until the other day. So she was important enough to the FBI to be one of the people that they wanted to hear about, and whether you had any connection with her. And this was several years after Marina and Lee.
Okay, let me, if there are other comments, otherwise, let me go back, first Tom.
Well, I feel very privileged just to have been here. I mean, I've been thinking about Priscilla for 40 years, like so many other people, and I've heard a ton of things I've never heard before. And I've heard a ton of things that reinforce things that I personally experienced. It was marvelous just to listen to all of these stories and these impressions. And I'm also impressed that how many arguments are just over the horizon when we speak. So avoid all of them. I thought that was a really good thing. And I'll pass my words on to Jim.
Thank you, Tom. I'm also honored and thrilled to be part of this gathering, and this will also stimulate a lot of additional reading and inquiries for me to catch up with some of you. But I just want to actually re-ask, since this is such this is a unique gathering. I want to re-ask the question. Priscilla finished Harvard and went to work for Senator Kennedy. I don't know if she's still there, just as the Oppenheimer case took place, and Oppenheimer, of course, was a titanic figure, a hero to Americans, and he became a villain to many Americans. I'm just curious if any of you remember Priscilla talking about her own views of Oppenheimer and how she got obsessed by his story, because I'm curious whether it was obsession with Oppenheimer and then out to these broad nuclear issues, or just concern about nuclear danger, which she obviously felt, and simply finding that the Oppenheimer case was a wonderful way to find a lens to examine these key issues. I'm just curious if any of you.
I wonder if
have
the,
any knowledge of that.
before people respond, I wonder if this new edition of the book might give.
I'm curious about that.
Yes, if either Marty talks about it in his forward. or
I'm gonna get it as soon as I'm back online.
I'll just offer one suggestion there. It was Teller.
Yeah.
She
That's what I was
was
gonna
furious
say.
with Teller.
She's harsh on
Tested
Teller.
Yeah,
Teller.
absolutely,
She
absolutely.
hunted Teller.
Yes.
Her goal was to destroy and injure Teller. I mean, she
Yeah, she's very harsh.
Yes.
I think it's.
She wasn't too happy about straws either.
No,
Yeah.
I would say Strauss less than Teller.
Oh, yeah.
But unless you had a personal connection and like read that telephone book size transcript, I'm curious when she would have come to that, because it wasn't immediately apparent unless you were one of the crowd of scientists, what Teller's role had been. And of course, later on, it took 30 years for his Freedom of Information FBI materials to start to emerge. You know, the late 70s, early 80s, that Teller had secretly spoken to the FBI and sort of primed the pump to get Oppenheimer. So I'm just curious how Priscilla came to that.
I think that's a really strong.
ABC security person to be more
Yeah,
precise, but no, he spoke at some length. If you read the documents.
I don't know, I did. I mean, I thought Priscilla, you know, and again, I really like Priscilla's book. I think she's kind of hard. But, please, yes. I'm
Well,
sorry.
I guess my own sense of Priscilla, in terms of motives, I can't speak exactly to the origin of the project, except to say, of course, that it happened after Marina Lee.
Right.
And I think it's a notable strand in her work that she investigates the people that destroy the source of hope. And so I do think that it's Teller and Strauss that she was exploring and providing some accountability for. And that, as you say, I think Oppenheimer was a template both for some hope and for, I think she was looking for the turning points of the Cold War. Those places after which things were inevitable or had to go in a certain direction. And I think it's the destruction of that moment when there might have been openness and instead there was secrecy.
I mean, my recollection from when I first met Priscilla in the mid-80s was that she was then contemplating writing a history of the hydrogen bomb.
That's right.
You know, how it was made and so forth. So, but over time, and you know, that was when the Cold War was still underway, and there were a lot of documents that were still impossible to get. But over time, the focus of the book did change much more.
I should add on the question for motivation. You know, one striking and yet a little bit cryptic thing is at the end of her introduction to the book, which came out 4 or 5 years after 9/11, was saying there are cases like this today. And she doesn't say who or what, but she's clearly concerned about the mania for security that she wrote about. She saw happening again, and she saw it as very much a warning.
Yeah, and I should add that unfortunately, because of the postponement of the memorial service and the memorial research seminar that we're having today, is there was going to be a panel on declassification and government openness, and Bill Burr, who in particular worked extensively with Priscilla, he's very reluctant to travel though, because there's some that I think he had some problem that he was worried about, so he wasn't able to come for either of those. But he was going to be addressing this subject, you know, how Priscilla was really dismayed, I think, at times by the excessive secrecy. I shared that view with her. You know, I think the U.S. government's declassification policies at times are utterly incomprehensible. And of course, most countries' policies are even worse. So especially the city. But Nick, do you want to offer?
I guess
This seminar has brought to my eyes and my understanding how much she contributed in an intellectual sense. She had many words of praise about it. She had stepped up and written about it. But as I look back on Priscilla, the point that really weighs on me, and I think on Ruth as well, was her humanity, her generosity, her willingness to cooperate and to be helpful. And so I'd like to leave you with that thought that not only did she actually contribute something, but she contributed help to those of you who were going to contribute something.
And Fred.
Well, just on that point, I mean, I have 2 points that I would make before, is precisely on that. And I think you made this point beautifully as well, the humanity, the humane essence of Priscilla, which comes through, even if you only meet her once, I would say. It's so important. You know, there's a saying, I think it's maybe attributed to Richard Polenberg, who was my Cornell colleague. It might not be his, but I love it, and I think it certainly applies when you're in the 02138 zip code, which is, Dick said something like this, you know, when he was speaking, I think, at Cornell. We're all pretty smart around here. Distinguish yourself by being kind. And I think I try to remember this myself. I think with mixed success, I'm sure. But I think it applies in spades to Priscilla. And the other thing I'll just say, which I said earlier, is, and I wish I could tell her this. I don't think I quite did, but I understand John F. Kennedy, who's an elusive figure. And I think even after I finish the second volume, he'll probably remain an elusive figure in some ways. But I understand him better because of my conversations with her. She said to me at one point, she said, I urge you to humanize Kennedy. Which, you know, a less elegant way of expressing that, I think, is to say, give us the warts and all picture of, which I hope I was planning to do anyway, but to hear her describe this as something I'm not to do, something that has stuck with me.
That's very interesting, because I think in that thing that Max wrote to us, he said that there had been someone who said that to Priscilla about the entire article. Tilly Olsen. In any case, as I think back on Priscilla, there are a couple of sort of expressions that I will want to remember, that kind of bashful smile, the way she would the very earnest nod, you know, a very serious nod, as though she had just fundamentally understood a profound, pointed, profound importance that you would convey to her, even though it's probably now. And other things, you know, part of that being kind that she regularly did. Okay, so I will end on 2 things of a contradictory nature. One of which is, if you go to the end of the hall here and then turn to the left, you'll eventually come to restrooms there, ladies and men's, which you'll see. On the other contradictory features, I'm eating sandwiches and have coffee and other such things. I've been amazed at the reluctance of people here today. Let me thank all of Priscilla's relatives who are here today, and also to everyone else who has come, and particularly to Tom and Jim and Fred.